To understand how the Khmer built what they built, you first have to understand where they built it. And that story starts not in Cambodia at all. It starts 50 million years ago with a slow-motion collision. The Indian tectonic plate was drifting north, minding its own business, when it ran head first into the Eurasian plate. It didn't stop. It just kept pushing, and the Earth ahead of it had nowhere to go but up. The result was the Himalayas, the tallest mountain range on the planet, and behind them, a vast frozen plateau sitting so high above sea level that some people call it the third pole. That's not a metaphor. The Tibetan Plateau holds more freshwater ice than anywhere outside the actual poles. Half of Asia essentially drinks from it. Out of that plateau, some of the most consequential rivers on Earth begin their journeys. The Yangtze, the Indus, and the one that matters most for this story, the Mekong. The Mekong doesn't rush. It takes its time, more than 4,000 kilometers winding south through China, Laos, Cambodia, and Thailand before finally spreading out into the South China Sea. Along the way, it becomes one of the most biologically extraordinary river systems on the planet. Freshwater dolphins, giant stingrays, catfish the size of small cars. This is not a polite, well-behaved river. It is enormous and alive, and it does what it wants. And right in the middle of Cambodia, it does something nobody warned you about. It meets a lake called the Tonle Sap, and this lake has a habit that would terrify most people and feed millions of others. For most of the year, the Tonle Sap drains normally into the Mekong, perfectly reasonable, very lake-like. But then, the monsoon arrives. The Mekong swells beyond what any sensible river should, and something bizarre happens at the junction point. The current reverses. The river stops draining the lake and starts filling it instead, pushing water backwards until the Tonle Sap bloats into something closer to an inland sea, stretching up to 250 kilometers long. The villages along its shores aren't built at the waterline. They're built 10 meters above it on stilts, because that's how much the water rises every single year. A Chinese traveler who visited Angkor once wrote that during flood season, the water swallowed entire treetops, leaving only the highest branches poking above the surface. He was probably exaggerating slightly. Probably. But here's the thing about a lake that tries to drown you once a year. It's also the reason you don't starve. Every time those floodwaters pull back, they leave behind an enormous deposit of nutrient-rich sediment. The result is one of the most productive freshwater fisheries anywhere on Earth, and soil fertile enough to grow rice at a scale most civilizations could only dream about. Rice, by the way, isn't just a crop the Khmer happen to grow. It's a crop that needs to sit in flooded fields to thrive. Controlling water wasn't a luxury for the civilization, it was survival. And the Khmer, it turned out, were extraordinarily good at it. That expertise, managing, redirecting, storing, and releasing water across a vast landscape, is what turned a promising kingdom into the largest city on Earth. But we'll get to the engineering in a moment. First, we need to talk about the other thing holding this empire together. The god-king system didn't die with Yashovarman II. Every king who followed him performed the same Hindu coronation ritual, the Deva Raja, and claimed the same divine authority. And that wasn't just flattery or theater. For most of Angkor's history, the king genuinely occupied both roles at once, head of government and living center of the state religion, and the two jobs were completely inseparable. That religion came from India, and India's influence on this corner of the world ran deep. There's an old Khmer legend about the founding of Cambodia that's worth pausing on, because it tells you exactly how the Khmer wanted to understand themselves. The story goes like this. There was once an Indian prince named Kandinya, descended from the sun god himself, who heard a mysterious voice instructing him to sail east to a land of gold. He made the crossing through monsoon winds and treacherous currents, the kind of journey that should have killed him. And when he finally reached the coast, his ship was attacked, not by pirates, by a serpent woman named Nagisoma. daughter of the Serpent King with fangs and a whipping tail. He fought her, he won, and then, instead of doing anything sensible, he proposed. She said yes. To mark the occasion, Kondinya hurled his golden spear onto the shore and declared that wherever it landed, he would build his city. He named the new kingdom Cambodia, which is of course where the word Cambodia comes from. Is any of this literally true? Almost certainly not. But myths don't survive for centuries because they're accurate. They survive because they're useful. And what this story tells you is that the Khmer elite wanted their origin story tied directly to India, sun gods and all. That wasn't an accident. It was a deliberate cultural statement. India's influence across Southeast Asia at this time was something like what American culture has become today, spreading not through direct conquest, but through trade, religion, and the slow drift of ideas that nobody quite decides to adopt. They just show up one day and they're everywhere. Local kingdoms absorbed India's social hierarchies, its Hindu myths and cosmology, and crucially, its language, Sanskrit. Think of it as the Latin of this story. Nobody was speaking it at the dinner table, but every scholar, every priest, and every royal court was writing in it, reciting from it, and using it to signal that they belonged to the educated class. You might assume Sanskrit is completely alien to you. It's not, actually. Sanskrit belongs to the same ancient language family as English. The Sanskrit word for tooth is danta, which is the same root that eventually became dentist in English, traveling through French, Latin, and ancient Greek along the way. 5,000 years of linguistic drift, and you can still see the family residency. The point isn't the etymology lesson. The point is that Sanskrit wasn't just a foreign import to the Khmer elite. It was the mark of sophistication, the thing that separated the court from everyone else. And that separation mattered more than it might seem, because most ordinary Cambodians weren't Hindu. Some followed Buddhism, others kept older animist traditions, leaving offerings for spirits living in rivers, hills, and trees. The religion of the palace and the religion of the rice paddy were two entirely different things, and the gap never really closed. It just sat there, quietly, waiting. We'll come back to that gap, because eventually it stops being quiet. For now, let's talk about the king who actually built the first great city on the site we now call Angkor. His name was Yashovarman, and his story starts, as so many stories do, with a family that couldn't quite get along. Yashovarman was the eldest son of Indravarman, and if you've noticed that every Khmer king's name ends in Varman, that's Sanskrit for shield. It was a tradition every Khmer ruler kept for 500 years. Jayavarman means victory shield. Yashovarman means something closer to glory shield. Whether he lived up to that name depends entirely on which part of his story you're reading. As the eldest son, Yashovarman had every reason to expect the throne when his father died. It was his by birth, by tradition, and by every normal expectation of how succession worked. His father had other ideas. He named the younger brother heir instead. Yashovarman did not take this gracefully. He raised an army, and Cambodia fell into a civil war, bloody and prolonged, fought both on land and across the waters of the Tonle Sap, the same lake that fed the entire empire, now turned into a battlefield. The inscriptions written about Yashovarman during this are something special. One describes him as a lion man who tore his enemies apart with the claws of his grandeur. His teeth, apparently, were his policies. His eyes were the holy scriptures. Khmer kings were never shy about narrating their own greatness, and Yashovarman's scribes were clearly working at full enthusiasm. You obviously can't take any of it literally, but it does tell you something true. It tells you exactly how he wanted to be remembered. Eventually, after a long and ugly fight, he won. The younger brother was defeated, and Yashovarman took the crown. But the grudge against his father never faded. Once he was king, he had his scribes reconstruct his entire family tree to skip his father's line completely, tracing his legitimacy instead through his mother, who was, conveniently, descended from the old royal blood of Chenla. His father had tried to write him out of the succession. Yashovarman simply wrote his father out of history. Petty? Absolutely. But also, apparently, effective. Because whatever personal grievances were driving him, Yashovarman turned out to be a genuinely formidable ruler. He built over 100 monasteries in his first year on the throne alone. Over a 20-year reign from 889 until his death around 910, he founded an entirely new capital city and, in a move that surprises nobody at this point, named it after himself, Yashovarman. Today, we just call it Angkor. But there's a shadow hanging over all of this, construction that comes from one of the stranger legends attached to his name. In some old traditions, Yashovarman carried a second title entirely, the Leper King. Leprosy is a bacterial disease that can lie completely dormant in the body for up to 20 years before the first symptoms appear. When it does emerge, it's brutal. Progressive nerve damage, disfiguring lesions, a slow and visible destruction of the body. It was one of the most feared diseases in the ancient world, and it wasn't even rare among rulers. Baldwin IV, king of Jerusalem in the 12th century, governed for a decade while the disease was actively killing him. Modern bone analysis has since confirmed that Robert the Bruce, King of Scotland, had it too. In Angkor today, there's a weathered statue in one corner of the royal terraces depicting Yama, the Hindu god of death. Centuries of rain and moss have eaten into the stone, leaving the surface pitted and discolored in a way that looks uncomfortably like diseased flesh. And that damage gave rise to a legend that what the statue actually depicts isn't Yama at all, but Yashovarman himself. We can't confirm it, we probably never will, but it's hard not to wonder. A man racing against a slow, disfiguring illness, watching his body betray him while he still has breath and power and an army of workers at his disposal. Would that not explain a frantic, almost desperate need to build? 100 monasteries in a single year, a capital city bearing his own name, temples and reservoirs and monuments designed to outlast everything that flesh cannot hold on to. Maybe it's just ambition, or maybe it's something more human than that. A man trying to outrun his own decay by raising something that will still be standing long after he isn't. We'll never know for certain. What we do know is that the foundations Yashovarman laid became the launchpad for everything that followed. From his reign forward, the Khmer Empire grew into the dominant power across all of Southeast Asia, and it rested on 3 pillars. The God-King system, which turned loyalty to the crown into something closer to religious devotion, a decentralized tax structure woven so tightly into the temple network that paying your dues to the state and making an offering to the gods were in practice the same act. And a third pillar, the one that actually explains how a city of 1 million people fed itself in the middle of a jungle. It goes back to that lake, the one that floods backward every year, the one that can swallow a forest and then feed a civilization once the water recedes. Because the Khmer were about to crack the problem of water in a way nobody had ever attempted before. Building a hydraulic system so vast and so complex, it would turn Angkor into the largest city on Earth. And that city would eventually produce something so staggering that a 19th century explorer, stumbling across its ruins centuries after it was abandoned, wrote that it was grander than anything left by Greece or Rome. That's where we're going next.